Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. This is the analysis of The Merchant's Tale, which you should have read with Jimmy. This is the summary, background, and the interpretation, which I subtitled The Blind Leading the Blind. Ready? What happened in this tale? Well, in The Merchant's Tale, we meet January, an old wealthy knight who suddenly decides to marry. Not out of love, but for reasons of comfort, legacy, and control. And he wants a young, obedient wife, and he views marriage the way one might acquire property. A lot of that going around in those days. Maybe even these days. January is not looking for a partnership. He's looking for a possession. Remember how the story started? In Lombardy once lived a prosperous knight who had satisfied his fleshy appetite on women 60 years without a wife. Okay? But turning 60, whether in devotion or merely in his dotage, the period of life in which a person is old and weak, he took the notion to be married, to be a married man and settle down. So then we meet May, the beautiful young bride chosen for her freshness. The merchant narrator, himself, he's bitter about marriage from his prologue narration, if you read it with Jimmy, portrays January's situation to us. For example, January believes marriage will guard him against sin and loneliness, and he invokes Solomon and other authorities to justify his desires. Remember, there's a lot of biblical references in these tales. You should know your Bible if you're going to read with Jimmy. But then the plot twists. Shortly after the marriage, we learn that his squire, the knight squire Damien, loves, or he desires, May. January goes blind. His loss of sight becomes kind of like a metaphor, a thing symbolic of something else, especially something abstract. He cannot see the truth of his situation or his wife's intentions. And meanwhile, May begins an affair with Damien, who with May's help slips into a garden that's symbolically locked by January, i.e. the garden is May. He locks his wife up, doesn't he? He tries to. And into May's arms while January clutches her hand. You remember that scene? January's blind. He's holding her hand. She's up in the tree, screwing around with Damien. But then, through divine intervention, if you remember the tale, the gods get involved in this, right? Well, Jimmy, I thought Chaucer's Catholic. It was Catholicism. The Catholics are there, but he's playing around with the gods, the Greek gods, the Roman gods. The gods Pluto and Proserpina, who are central to the resolution of this story, how it resolves itself, suddenly January's sight is restored just in time to catch May and Damien in the act. But May, quick thinking and practice in deception, convinces January that what he saw, what he's looking at with his own eyes, is an illusion. A lot of that going around in there. Part of her plan to restore his sight, she says. Oh, it's just, no, that's not what you're seeing. This is part of my plan. And January believes her. Remember this passage? With this, she sprang down lightly from the tree. Who now rejoices if it is not he? Who he? Right? January, her husband, stroking her softly and with many a kiss. Back to his palace he leads her home in bliss. And so I end my tale of January, and God bless us and his Holy Mother Mary. That's the merchant. So in this tale of justice served cold, foolishness is rewarded with lies? Huh? Is May a villain, or is she a survivor? Is January just a blind fool, or does he embody male vanity and controlled disguise as piety? Well, in the end, it's up to each of us to think through and decide for ourselves what the hell's in this story, right? And that's what's remarkable about all these tales from Chaucer, all these Canterbury tales. They are classic literature, charged with meaning, and they show us how others lead their lives and how we should lead ours. I'm not telling you to go up in a tree, ladies and gentlemen. Narrators. The merchant is the narrator of this tale, but let's not forget it's really the anonymous narrator who tells us what the merchant is saying. It's a story inside a story and another story inside of that. It's something like this. Anonymous narrator is talking to us about one of the pilgrims, and in this case, it's the merchant. And they're all on a journey to Canterbury, so the anonymous narrator is also one of the pilgrims, who is a narrator, relays the tale of January and May. The merchant does. That the merchant is telling us, or he's telling the other pilgrims. So the merchant talking to the other pilgrims, the anonymous narrator telling us what the merchant is telling these people. This is not true third-person narration where the narrator is outside the story. For example, in the story of Job, Job was a good man. Who says that? Who's the narrator? Well, it's somebody outside that story. And if you don't believe that Job was a good man, the rest of the story makes no sense. So a third-person narrator is often called omniscient, a godlike narrator outside the story, not like us. Each of us is inside the story, right? We live, we breathe, we work with other people. This is first-person narration. All the tales are. They're first-person narration. And that's something we have to keep in mind. The anonymous narrator, we assume, I know it's always dangerous, is doing his best to tell us what the merchant is saying. He doesn't color it with his own prejudices or beliefs. And I think when you read it with me, we find out that this anonymous narrator is fairly accurate, right? He's pretty reliable. But it's complex narration, which makes understanding and appreciate complexity, which in turn makes this classical literature. This is not dime novels. This is not Jack Reacher beating up people. Yeah. Jimmy has read Jack Reacher. And you know what? That's good, but it's not classical literature. This website is about classical literature. I'm never going to read a Reacher novel. You can read that on your own time. So what does this merchant look like, according to the anonymous narrator? What's this guy look like? Let's see what he looks like from the prologue. Among the rest, this is from the prologue, the beginning of all the tales, which you should have read by now with Jimmy. Unless you're choosing to read the merchant's tale first. I don't know why you would do that, but if you do, go back and read the prologue where all these people are introduced. Among the rest, a merchant also came. Who's saying that is the anonymous narrator. He wore a forked beard and a beaver hat from Flanders. High up in the saddle he sat, in figured cloth, his boots clasped handsomely, delivering his opinions pompously, always on how his grains might be increased. At all costs he desired the sea policed. Why? To protect his goods. From Middelburg in Holland to Orwell. He knew the exchange rates and the time to sell French currency, and there was never yet a man who could have told that he was in debt. And so grave he seemed, and hid things so well, his feelings, with all his shrewd engagements and close dealings. In other words, he had a great poker face, right? And you'd find him no better a man than any turn. And what was his name? I could never learn. So we never learn who this merchant is. We don't know his name. And we try to render him. That's not him. That's actually who? January the 9th, right? You can paint your own picture of the merchant, or I'll show you later in one of my 10-minute takes. So, some key words stand out to keep in mind since the merchant will be the narrator in this January-May saga. Let's start with beaver hat from Flanders. What do you think that means? He looks like Davy Crockett. He's got a beaver hat. Remember, classical literature is language charged with meaning. More so because there's no television, there's no radio, there's no cell phones, there's nothing when these things were written except words. Remember, Chaucer's so important because it's the first English. People used to write in different languages, right? This is one of the first English pieces. Beautifully written. Every word, phrase, sentence counts. There's no wasted words. Let's take a peek. So the beaver hat at that time was a luxury item made of beaver fur imported from Flanders and places the merchant probably visited within the world of international trade at that time and a rising mercantile class. It was expensive, fashionable, and associated with a kind of conspicuous consumption. I'm buying it because I can afford it. That marked one's financial status without necessarily confirming it. You'll see how people are dressed, what the narrator describes them as they dress. He's conveying to you their, what? Yes, their personalities. You dress, the way you dress expresses your personality. When Jimmy was in the business world heavily for over 30 years, I always wore a suit and tie, always, dressed for success. My wife accuses me of sleeping with a tie. Not that I did. But I would not go to a client to work, to my offices, without a tie and a suit coat on. My greatest mistake was when I told the people that worked for me, especially the art directors, who I used to make to wear a tie, not to wear a tie. That was a big mistake. Generosity was my first mistake. That's from The Magnificent Seven. It's a great movie. Anyway, in short, it says that he wants to look prosperous, but maybe more than he is. And you see how this enriches the story when you know this? So if you're one of the pilgrims or you're listening to somebody tell these tales in those days and you hear this guy wore a beaver hat from Flanders, that's kind of like we're saying, well, he had a Gucci suit on or he had a suit on, right? One of those very expensive suits. You can still read the story if you don't know it, but the words come alive when you do know it. In other words, you can say, oh, beaver hat from Flanders. You can read it like that when we were reading it, but now that you know what it means, those words are charged with meaning. And that's the importance of classical literature, to read and reread and reread. Keep reading it, and you'll get more and more out of it. The merchant speaks seriously of profit and trade routes, and he talks about how the sea should be guarded at all costs. Why do you think he's saying that? Well, the narrator notes he delivers opinions pompously. Do you know what that means? If you're pompous, something done or said in a way that's exaggerated or dignified. So happy to meet you. That's a pompous way of saying, glad to meet you. Self-important, ostentatious, right? Like a peacock. And it implies arrogance, right? That's what that means, pompously. Always on how his gains might be increased. And there was never yet a man who could have told that he was in debt. So grave he seemed and hid so well his feelings. So the narrator says you'd find no better man at any turn. Well, what his name was, I could never learn. So the narrator judges him to be a good man, a better man. No one's better than him. No, you'd find no better man at any turn. What's the word better? Good? Does it mean good? What is better? Dressed well? What is better? You have to decide. The hat, like the merchant himself, is part of an image. He presents, a presentation, so to speak. So it's our first impressions of the people that we get in the prologue. And in this case, according to the anonymous narrator, he presents himself as successful, dressed in elegant boots, a forked beard. The image that's painted by the narrator contrasts with other groups. You know how he described the other people if you read the prologue with me. The knight, for instance, wears a Tuscan tunic, Sorry, it should be Tuscan tunic with rust. So the knight is dressed in a rust, stained with rust from what? His armor. While the merchant is polished, worldly. Which man is more authentic? Don't forget, what we tell people, dialogue reveals character. Don't forget, what we tell people, right, reveals character. He's dressing like a slob, Jimmy. You're telling me not only what that person you view is dressed as, but you're revealing your own character. He's dressed like a slob, as opposed to he's not. His clothes are not dignified. See the difference? These pilgrims select the topics they talk about. No one tells them the kind of stories to tell. They pick these stories. And they pick these stories for a reason. So if we switch from the general prologue to the merchant's prologue, we can experience his pompous narrative style that he says in the central topic of the tale, marriage. Here's what he says. Tell me this is not pompous. I know sufficiently by night and morrow, the merchant said, and others also know, if they are married men. To prove it so, I tell you that it happens thus with me. I have a wife, the worst one there could be. For though the fiend were yoked with her, I swear she'd overmatch him and have strength to spare. So he's married to a tough lady, right? Imagine that. He's married, but if the devil were tied to his wife, she would overmatch the devil. Huh? Why in detail should I expose to view her bitter malice? She's a perfect shrew. There is a wide and mighty opposition between Griselda's wonderful submission and the exceeding cruelty of my wife. Oh, could I untie the knot? For all my life, I never again would tumble in that snare. We married men, we live in grief and care, and by St. Thomas, whoever tries it out will find that I speak the truth beyond the doubt. So he's not a fan of marriage, is he? He's married to a shrew. What's a shrew? Well, it's a scolding, bad-tempered woman. Shrew. Did you ever hear that? A shrew. I wonder what a scolding, bad-tempered man is called. A shrewer? Or a jerk? Or the reference to Griselda is important and gives us a rich meaning of allusions. This is called an allusion. Most people he was talking to would know the story of Griselda. And they would relate to that one word and would bring up a story in their head. Just like sometimes allusions now. If you hear, for example, a president's name, and you were alive when that president was around, or you weren't alive, maybe you read about him, like Eisenhower. If you hear that name, it brings up, he's the guy who led D-Day. It's what comes to Jimmy's mind. You may not even get an image of Eisenhower because you've never read about him or know about him, which is why it's important to read classic literature. To read. Always read. These are references to well-known stories or characters, like I was telling you, and they enrich the story. That one word, Griselda, is so charged with meaning that if you take it out of that sentence, right, between a woman's wonderful submission, if you just said a woman, that doesn't have the same texture. I'm going to use Griselda to show you how language is enriched. But for example, May is compared to Griselda. A woman who is the epitome of patience and obedience. But May, in fact, is the opposite. So there's a little irony here. She's deceitful and calculating. So the illusion becomes irony. And if you don't know who Griselda is, you miss the richness. You cannot appreciate this as much as you did if you know. So who is Griselda? Well, Her story didn't begin with Chaucer. It comes from Boccaccio's Decameron. I told you about that when we were looking at the prologue. Boccaccio was an Italian writer, right, who wrote the Decameron and was retold by Petrarch before Chaucer seems to take it. Now, I told you Chaucer, very well educated. We don't like to talk about the authors too much because we like to stay inside the story. But we're going to take a digression here. So I want to pause for a moment. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron between 1348 and 53. Chaucer wrote between 1387 and 1400, and then he left it it was unfinished when he never finished it. Kind of like Leonardo da Vinci never finished some of the stuff he did, right? So Decameron predates Canterbury by 30 years, 3 decades. Did Chaucer read Boccaccio? Your guess is as good as mine. And scholars who like to do this, they debate this a lot. It's good to know, but you don't need to know. You need to know who Boccaccio is, and if you want to, you should read the Decameron. They're good stories. Get a good translation. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Send me an email. I'll recommend a good translation because it is written in Italian. But Chaucer never mentions Boccaccio, unlike Dante or Petrarch, who he does mention. Okay? So remember, you don't need to know these things. They just help with your appreciation. In fact, when I read Chaucer as a student, it drove me to read the Decameron. I said, I got to read it. So I read it. I don't know if I'm putting it on this website yet. But anyway, Dante gave Italian literature moral and cosmological backbone. That's a big word. Petrarch gave it introspection, Boccaccio brought it down to earth, and Chaucer took them all in and gave us the Canterbury Tales. Did he read Boccaccio? Who cares? Did he read Dante? Probably, because he was well educated. Did he read Petrarch? Yes, probably. So Griselda. Griselda is a poor but beautifully and morally upright peasant girl. Gualtieri is the Marquis of Saluzzo, and he decides to marry a commoner to ensure obedience in his wife. He wants his wife to obey him. There's a lot about men and women in marriage in these tales, isn't there? That's going to be in the big wrap-up, which I'll do after we're done reading all the tales. And to test her loyal, he subjects Griselda to increasingly cruel trials. He pretends to have her children taken away and killed. They're not actually killed. He casts her out of his home. What a jerk. And eventually he tells her that he's remarrying and asks her to prepare for the wedding for the new bride. And through it all, Griselda remains obedient, loyal, composed. It's kind of like Penelope in the Odyssey. Jimmy will read the Odyssey if he hasn't already on this website. And composed. And in the end, Gualtieri reveals that it was just a test, returns her children, and takes his wife back. I'd still say he's a jerk, and if I was Griselda, what would you do? Anyway, social status. Penelope, I told you in Homer, she waits for years as Odysseus tries to make his way back from the Battle of Troy, right? Takes him 20 years to get home. It's a good story. Penelope was noble queen. She was poor. She was actively resisting her suitors. She would try to she told him, I'll marry you, because Odysseus wasn't coming home, and they wanted to marry her. She had a lot of suitors. They wanted to marry her. She says, I'll only marry one of you when I complete this shawl. So she would stitch the shawl all day, and then she would unstitch it at night. And these buffoons never figured that out until almost 18 years passed. Griselda just passively obeyed. She accepted all of the tests. Agency, exercises cunning and, surrenders her will. She submits to her husband's will. Suffering, her husband was absent, and her suffering comes from the cruelty of the husband. Why does this reference matter? Well, the merchant is cynical about women in marriage, isn't he? And his wife is, I'm married to a shrew. So by mentioning Griselda, the woman is held up by other stories. He either mocks the ideal upright or he twists it to show how laughably rare that is, that loyalty in a wife. Just as Januarie sees May as angelic, the narrator calls her Griselda-like to underscore the false image. So the merchant who's only been married 2 months, no more than that, and yet vows that men with a helpmate all their lives aren't as sad as him from my wife's cursedness. This is not a happy camper. But his tale reflects unhappiness. Consider the opening, which I told you all the time is extremely important. In classical literature, the opening of the story is key to the entire story. That's why you have to read it and reread it and reread it. In Lombardy once lived a prosperous knight who had satisfied his fleshy appetite on women 60 years without a wife, and do these fools of irreligious life, as do these fools of irreligious life. That's a potent statement. So then Januarie decides to take a wife because no other life, he said, is worth a bean. Wedlock is happy, spotless, and serene. So much so he's been really farting around for 60 years, and now he decides, well, I better get married. A marriage is a solemn sacrament. She never answers no when he says yes. Do this, he says. It's all right, sir, she said. So he's got this image of what a wife is. Is that a true image of a wife? What is a wife? Have you defined what a wife is? At the same time, he says, a faithful servant shows more diligence in keeping your possessions than your wife, for she will lay claim to half of them for life. Don't forget, he's a merchant, right? His allusions are many, including Adam and Eve. Do you know your Bible stories? Here's from the King James Version. This is the version Jimmy prefers to read. It's the English version that was translated from the Latin text from that they wrote, that only monks who were educated could read, until King Henry VIII decided to translate it when he broke from the church. So the King James Version of the Bible is the one you'll see Jimmy quote often. And God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, the cattle, all over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So Adam gave names to all of the cattle, the fowl of the earth, and the beasts of the field. And for Adam there was not found a helpmate for him. And so the Lord God caused them to fall deeply asleep. And upon Adam, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib, which the Lord had taken from man, made he a woman, brought her unto the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall you didn't know that, did you? Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, and the man and his wife were not ashamed. That's in the Garden of Eden, right? Eden. You know the rest of the story? If not, you better read it. It's an important story. It's a base story. What Jimmy means by base story is not really an ugly story. It's a base story from which spring many, 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 many other stories. It's one of those great stories that has sprung additional stories. And that's why you got to have this in your head if you're going to understand classical literature. Because that story is about disobedience. What's this story about? What's this merchant's tale about? January and May. What do you think it's about? Disobedience to your vows, right? So now it's not the time to review all the complexity of Adam and Eve, but let me sum it up. The serpent asks Eve, who's yet to be named by Adam, right, if God said not to eat every tree in the garden. And Eve says, we can eat anything we want but the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden. God said, no, don't eat that stuff. They can't touch the fruit or we'll die. And so the serpent says, you won't die if you eat that fruit. God knows that the day you eat that fruit, your eyes are going to be open and you're going to be like gods. You're going to know the difference between good and evil. And that's why they call it the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the serpent, the devil, is telling Eve, you can't, that's why he doesn't want you to eat it, because you will know the difference. So Eve sees the tree. It looks pretty good. It's pleasant to look at. And since it would make her wise, according to the serpent, careful who you believe, she ate it. She also gave some to Adam. And then the story says, and the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. So that's important. They didn't know they were naked until they ate the tree. What is that? What the hell does that mean, right? Well, it's the knowledge of good and evil. Does that mean being naked is bad, or is it good? They were naked before. Does that mean they were good and suddenly that's not good? Can good become not good? You see how complicated this is? I'm not going to answer these questions now. So then the Lord comes into the garden and they hide themselves, and God says, where are you guys? And Adam says, I was afraid because I was naked. And God said, who told you you were naked? Did you eat from that tree that I told you not to? And Adam says that the woman gave him the fruit. So I ate it. She gave me the fruit, Lord. And then everything falls apart. God asks the woman, what have you done? Eve says, wait, it was the serpent who charmed me, beguiled me. So God tells the serpent, because he did this, you're cursed above all cattle and every beast, and you're going to crawl on your belly and you're going to eat dust the rest of your life. Makes you wonder if the serpent wasn't crawling to begin with. You see what I'm saying? Maybe the serpent was walking. I don't know. I wasn't there. God then tells the woman that he will put enmity, actively opposed or hostile to someone. He's going to put anger between the man and the woman, and he's going to multiply the woman's sorrow when she brings forth children, and her desire to thy husband. And who will rule over her? And to Adam, God says, because you listened to your wife and you ate from that tree, you're going to eat sorrow all the days of your life. And this is where the famous line, dust thou art, dust thou shalt return, comes from. So like I said, this story is very complicated. But isn't it reflective of what happens in this tale? There's jealousy, right? Jealousy. There's jealousy, adultery, lying, sorrow. And what's with Januarie's brother, Placebo and Justinus? They are there to debate the question of Januarie's marriage intentions. The youngest man among them will be doing all he can by keeping his wife his own. You won't trust me. Please her for 3 years or less than 3 years, that is to say, to her full satisfaction. A wife imposes many a strict extraction, I hope, with all of this that you're not off. So they're debating the pros and cons of marriage. They agree finally that, Januarie should be married. But there's a lot of to and fro about marriage when they're talking. And it's important to read that, isn't it? So what is marriage, ladies and gentlemen? What is marriage? A human bond, a cultural mirror. In different cultures, different wedding ceremonies, marriages. It's one of the oldest institutions in human history. But what it means, what marriage means, has changed. Like all words change. meanings change. If you define marriage today, it means legally or formally recognized union of two people as partners in a personal relationship, right? Well, that's a sound definition, Jimmy, but what the hell does that mean? Legally and formally recognized union. What is a union? What is that? Joined at the hip? Siamese twins have a union. Are they married? You know what I'm talking about? You see what I'm saying about words? Throughout history, marriage has been a contract, a covenant, a sacrament, a property exchange, a love story, a prison, a promise. Sometimes all of these at once, sometimes all of them. During the late 14th century, marriage was understood as both a legal arrangement and for the Catholic Church, it's a sacrament. What's a sacrament? Well, it's something sacred, right? Sacrament, something sacred ordained by God, meant to reflect the union of Christ and the church. There's a lot of baptism is a sacrament in the Catholic Church. You get baptized to show your acceptance, to God's laws. But it didn't always work that way in practice, as we see from the way the merchant talks about these characters. And even if you reviewed other tales already with Jimmy, and I hope you did, you'll see that unions, marriages, are not always what they're cooked up to be. There's cheating going on, there's lying going on, and yet there's also tenderness going on. If you recall the Knight's Tale, the first tale you should have read after the prologue, which was a long one, it's about two knights who fall in love with a woman and never tell her till the end. And she doesn't want anything to do with marriage, and yet she ends up marrying one of them. You see, it's a complicated issue. Complicated. Even in Jimmy's age, Jimmy's been married a long time, over a long, I'm not even going to tell you how long. But when he first met his wife, one of her sisters had two arranged marriages by my wife's father. They both failed miserably. You can't arrange this stuff. You can try. So, a brief history, and you can read this on your own. I won't read it all. Ancient world, transition, blah, 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 inheritance, alliances. Hebrew scripture, there's a covenant. That's the story we read of Adam and Eve. Roman law, it's a contract. Marriage was a civil contract, dissolvable. It's all about contracts. Money is often at the root of a marriage. In fact, I would argue, and I would suggest to you respectfully, that when marriages fall apart, the root cause is money. Money, if you haven't figured it out, ladies and gentlemen, is behind everything. Right? A church takes over marriage as a sacrament around the 12th century, blah, blah, blah. Marriage was seen as permanent, no divorce. If you practice Catholicism, strict Catholicism, this is still true, even though the rules change sometimes. Monogamous, exclusive, don't fool around. It's like, you can only have one God before me, right? That's one of the laws of Catholicism. Well, you should only have one wife. Christ's union with the church, a remedy for lust. It's a path to holiness. So, what is marriage? Well, it's a covenant of mutual support. That's a nice definition. I like it. That's why I put it here. It's companionship and trust. In the end, it's really how you define it. How you define it. It's not how Jimmy defines it. It's not how Januarie defines it. It's not how any of these other characters, these pilgrims, define it. It's how you define it. You have to define it. What does marriage mean to you? If you look at the animal world, some animals mate for life, like bald eagles and wolves. Did you know that? Rabbits or cats are sure, well, they don't care. Anything comes their way. But we never hear of bald eagles getting married. They never married. They just mate for life. Is marriage mating? Can you get married without mating? You don't see a fox suing another fox for emotional neglect, and you don't see wolves renegotiating the terms of affection. They either pair for life or they don't. Bald eagles will return to the same nest year after year, repairing it together, co-parenting. Cats will mate and walk off and leave the consequences and not give it a second glance. So we call ourselves rational animals, ladies and gentlemen. We're rational thinking animals. And we apply reason mostly in retrospect. Oh, I should have done that. I should have thought this through to justify. But we build entire institutions around love. We wrestle endlessly with these terms. Is it sacred? Is it legal? Is it exclusive, equal, permanent, flexible, blah, blah, blah. But the fact that we even have marriage counselors, divorce courts, prenuptial agreements, etc., this tells you this isn't just biology. It's not just lust. It's not just mating. It's not just physical. There's something deeper if you define it properly. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But if you're going to define it as a covenant, it's a decision. We still have instincts, the desire for companionship, security. We overlay them with faith, philosophy, and laws. We elevate something deeply animal into something moral. And that's where it really gets interesting, right? If you take something that's ingrained in us instinctively and then you try to apply morality to it. Some people stay together forever. Others, right, they hop around. Urban foxes in mating season. They go it alone sometimes, right? They just don't want anything to do with it. Some never define the relationship. Some live together. We're just living together, Jimmy. That's fine. Who cares, right? If that's what is that what you're living to? What does that mean? You're living together. That you share the expenses of the apartment? Do you brush your teeth together? Maybe the question isn't what marriage is, but what we're asking it to do. What are we asking it, marriage, the word, to do? What do we do? All right? For a few, the lucky one, just to be honest, it's a daily decision. Commitment, integrity, honesty, trust, these are all daily decisions. When you wake up in the morning, you take a vow to be truthful and honest, or you don't. Well, maybe I'll lie today. Maybe today I don't want to be married anymore. You see? Right? I don't know. Remember how you define your terms is important. When Jimmy got married 50 years ago, I let the cat out of the bag. I took my wife to the beach, who's still my wife, and I sat her down and I defined marriage. And I said, this is what I define this word as. And I said, what do you define it as? And she looked at me like I was crazy. Right? I'm serious. She's still today, when I tell her this story again, she says, yeah, I remember that. I thought you were crazy. But doing that has kept us together all these years because I defined it then, and my definition, ladies and gentlemen, has not changed. Well, Jimmy, will you tell us your definition? No, I'm not going to tell you my definition. Well, maybe I will if you email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. But I'm not going to tell you here what my definition is because I struggled with that definition for at least 10 years before I met my wife, because I kept looking at other marriages, trying to figure out how do they define it. Knowledge is comparison. And I've defined it the same way ever since. Some definitions change. My definition didn't. And in tales like The Merchant, we see just what marriage is supposed to be, but what sometimes people make of it. Was Januarie ever married to me? He didn't marry her. There was a contract, right? But were they ever married? I don't think so. You're going to read another tale on this website called The Franklin's Tale, where they are married. Those two people in that tale got married, and they stayed married, despite what happens to them. And that's a good tale to read in retrospect and in comparison to this tale. Because in this tale, they clearly tell you what the way you don't want to define marriage. If you get married and you call your wife a shrew, you're not married, ladies and gentlemen. You're just not married. Vice versa, if the woman calls a husband a jerk, you're not married. Although I still remember Witches of Eastwick, Witches of Eastwick, which was Jack Nicholson's, where he played the devil. And he has a great line in there. I'm going to say it anyway. Men, as the witches were talking to him, and he was talking about how men can do this and that. And then he looks at them in the Jack Nicholson way with his eyes kind of like, half closed and half open with that crazy, crazy look and crazy voice. Men can be such assholes. Huh? It's a good movie. It's a good movie. Not that only men could be like that. Anyway, the idea of marriage is endlessly debated. It's like a tug of war. So let's go through various definitions. January, how does he define it? He sees marriage as a private Eden. It's a perfect place. He can enjoy the pleasures of youth, likes to bed his wife legally without shame. It's a cure for lust, safeguard his estate, legacy, a way to ensure sexual access. He needs that sex, right? A relationship where he's going to be the master and she'll be obedient. So he's cloaked selfishly practical. He uses scripture, right? He turns even to a possession. She's mine. I own her. And that's really the wrong way to define this. Justinus' definition of marriage is a trap, right? One of his brothers says, no, it's a trap, brother. He offers a cautionary definition, skeptical, world-wise. It's a burden for all men. Wives will be deceitful. Marriage will bring you dishonor. So you should take a wife advisedly. His speech, which you remember if you read it with me, is soaked in anti-marital rhetoric. Anti-marital rhetoric. And he warns his brother that young wives can lead to old men foolish ruin, which she does. But again, circumstances play the fact that she gets out of it through her cleverness. His other brother's definition, it's an opportunity to please. He says, maintaining January's favor. His definition is whatever January wants, it's going to be that. Beyond criticism. It's a chance to affirm authority, avoid contradiction. It's convenient. It's convenient. Placebo, the Latin name is I will please. So the narrator's voice, right, the merchant, is as absurd debate. The merchant is so bitter from his own marriage, as you saw, that no one really knows what marriage is. Everyone just uses it. So it's all BS. May's definition, right, his wife, never gives a grand speech about marriage, but her actions define her philosophy. She defines it as a social and economic performance. She gets to live in the comfort of the home, right? I got to endure it. I don't have to embrace it. Oh, okay, I got to endure this guy. It can be navigated through deception and not obedience. Read The Wife of Bath. That's the dissertation on marriage, her prologue. Her prologue is a dissertation on marriage. And then you'll understand how you might define it. So she doesn't rage or rebel. She smiles, lies, cheats, and she wins. The garden seat with Damien shows that she's reclaiming control. She controls. There's a lot about control in these tales. Who controls it? Power. It's a study of power. And These Gods is a cosmic comedy. They say it's fun. It's a tug of war. You take a little of this, you take a little of that. So what is marriage in The Merchant's Tale? Well, it depends who's talking. It's paradise to him. It's a trap to him. It's a yes to him. And it's a bitter joke to the guy who's telling the story. It's a game that I have to win to the wife. And to the gods, it's just a funny comedy. So the merchant seems to be saying, ladies and gentlemen, marriage may be sacred in theory, but in practice, it's all BS. Do you believe that? Why are marriage statistics crumbling in front of our eyes? I can tell you why. Nobody defines it. No one defines it. Really, really, really defines the word. You got to define your words. If you haven't figured it out, classical literature will help you define your terms that you use. And you won't use them lightly anymore. Well, marriage, you just get married, get divorced, get married again. Some of these stars, right? These movie stars have been married 5, 6 times. How the hell do you do that? Pluto's marriage to Prospernia is a strange, dark, and charged. Read the myth with Jimmy. Pluto is known as Hades. Prosperion is the daughter of Ceres, Dempter. And in the myth, he sees her picking flowers. He abducts her and takes her to the underworld without her consent. Rape. Circe, her mother, is devastated and causes the world to fall into famine. So then there's a compromise. She'll spend half of the year in the underworld, fall and winter, and half of the year, spring and summer, on the earth. And now you know where the seasons come from. Let's hear it. You never knew that, did you? So in the fall and the winter, she's down in hell. And in the spring and summer, she's up here. So right now, it's summer when Jimmy's reading this, and she's up here somewhere. Wait a minute, Jimmy, you don't believe in the Greek gods, do you? I'm just saying. They make a nice, rich, the word I'm looking for, tapestry. Remember that word in my final analysis. Tapestry. This myth is, the myth is not a love story. It's a story of power, force, compromise. Prosperion is the only Pluto half of the year, blah, blah, blah. You can pause me and read this if you want to. I'm going to whip through this. This matters in the Merchant's Tale because May lives in 2 worlds. Outwardly, you see how that matches? Outwardly, she's an obedient wife, but inwardly, she's a cunning lover, just like Prosperion. May plays her role, but she doesn't belong to either side. She's like floating through sides, right? In the Merchant's Tale, now, Prosperion, she had no choice. Pluto took her down, right? Hades to Hades. He took her down. He raped her, stole her against her will. Pluto tries to assert male control. He vows to give Januarie his sight back so he can see May's betrayal. But Prospernia fires back, and she declares that women will always have an answer ready no matter what. So she wins the argument. This is one of the most humorous scenes ever written. You remember it? When she's up in the tree with Damien, he gets his sight back, and she convinces him that she's just doing this so he can get his sight back. Oh! Plot and Aristotle. If you've been reading with Jimmy a long time, or this is your first reading, pause me here and read this footnote about Aristotle. Jimmy loves Aristotle, and he overlays Aristotle on all classical literature. The most important element is plot, followed by character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song. Plot's the most important thing, and there's a lot of action in this story. Plot can be simple or complex, and there's footnotes here. Pause me and read them. The Merchant's Tale is a simple plot of unified action with a clear beginning and a middle and an end, but it has no reversal recognition. None of these characters change as a result of what happens, do they? Does May change, or was she always May? Does January change, or was he always January? Right? None of them change. Damien doesn't change. He's hitting on the wife, right? Here's the trajectory. Old knight wants a wife, marries a young woman, goes blind, May cheats. January regains sight, but is deceived again. They go on as though nothing had happened. So there's no reversal of fortune like you see in Hamlet, where there's recognition. We'll talk about classical tragedies and plots in other stories. But in here, this is just a simple tale. Man, guy gets married, wife cheats on him. He uncovers it, but she convinces him that he's only seeing things, that his eyes are deceiving him. Doesn't that happen a lot these days? So, it's a simple thematic, it's a moral story too. It's moral. Merchant is anti-marriage, right? He said that from the beginning. He's anti-marriage. He's married to a shrew. So his story paints an anti-marriage picture of what marriage is. Do you believe that picture? Is that the picture you would paint? What is a marriage? You see the beauty of classical literature? It's all about you and how you define it based on what you see these characters do. Do you think that all wife or men cheat on their wives and husbands? What is cheating? What does that mean? If you cheat on your wife or your husband, what does that mean? Well, you've been reading the interpretation analysis of... I'm not going to get into that. We'll be here for another hour. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. There's my email right here. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Send me your emails. I'd be happy to engage in a discussion with you on what marriage is. I talk to a lot of people when they email me, back and forth, right? Some people I don't respond to. That's because what they email me is kind of stupid. I don't respond to stupid. I respond to sincere questions about what's bothering you. Some of them are very deep. And I really appreciate what you send me. Anyway, this is an analysis of The Merchant's Tale. I thank you for being here. I hope you read it with me. I'm on YouTube. That's the code you can scan in your phone and get right to there. And there's the address of the YouTube. You're on the website now if you're reading this. Or maybe you're not. Maybe you're on YouTube. And anyway, I appreciate you being here. And remember, it's up to you to define the words you live by. You can look them up in the dictionary, but that's not going to be the definition you give it. You have to do it. And there's only one way to do it. You can't do it quickly, neatly, and efficiently. It takes reading classical literature. Thanks for being here. Stay true to yourself and enjoy the day.